I'm Richard Heeks, Director of the Centre for Development Informatics at University of Manchester. So we've got 10 staff, 30 or so doctoral researchers, 100 postgrads, all doing various aspects of research on ICTs for development. We like to call ourselves the largest centre worldwide researching ICT for D. My talk today then is going to be looking at the fact that the Millennium Development Goals have a sell-by date of 2015. And 2015 is not far away, and we're going to have after 2015 a post-2015 development agenda. That's it being increasingly discussed, and we could probably recognise it as the single most important factor that is going to shape the future of international development. So, alongside the forces that are going to shape the trajectories for ICT over the next few years, the post-2015 agenda is going to be a key factor that will mould the future context for our work on development informatics. You know, we all want our research to have an impact. We all want to reach out to the maximum research and policy and practice agenda. The way you do that is by dipping your hand into the river of ICT for D and finding out where the fast-flowing currents are. And it's my belief that the post-2015 development agenda is going to represent the fast-flowing currents in ICT and D research. So that's why I think it's important for us to know about it. So, what is the post-2015 development agenda? At the moment, it's not so much an agenda as a process, so I've drawn up the timeline here, beginning in September 2011, when the UN System Task Team was formed. That's the UN body that has responsibility for forming the post-2015 agenda. 2012, 2013, various reports were produced, and there were various national and sectoral consultations taking us to where we are now. The new, 68th session of the United Nations, which is starting to discuss this, and then from next year onwards there's going to be a series of discussions and meetings. 2015, a series of political negotiations, and then, presumably, from January 2016, the post-2015 agenda will be in place, just as the MDGs were in place. Actually, of course, the MDGs didn't really come into place until 2002, but things probably will be better planned for the PTDA, the post-2015 development agenda. So, we are right in the middle of a process. How do we know what the actual agenda is going to be? And here we run into a slight snag, because actually paralleling what happened with the MDGs, we don't have one, but we have two processes going on together. You can't possibly see any of this. I understand that, but you can see there's a box there, and there's a box there, and there's some others. So, all this stuff that's going on up here is the official post-2015 development agenda. Down here is Rio Plus 20. I'm sure you're aware of that, the conference that was held in Rio, and that is moving towards producing a set of sustainable development goals, and at some point in 2014 and 2015 those two things will come together to form the post-2015 development agenda. So if we want to know what the post-2015 development agenda is at the moment, we actually have to draw together two different tracks and understand that this timeline represents those two tracks integrated together. What it means is our best guess of what the post-2015 development agenda is going to contain will be in these four documents. Two of them produced by the UN System Task Team, one the outcome of the Rio Plus 20 conference process so far, and a high-level panel that was put together by Ban Ki-moon, which reported in mid-2013. So that's the process, that's where we are at the moment. But we obviously need to step back a little bit and ask a few questions about post-2015 before we plunge straight in and say, okay, I'm going to devote my life's work and my research to that agenda. And the first question would be, how important is the post-2015 agenda going to be for international development? Because it's just going to gather dust. If it's just a sideshow, then clearly we shouldn't be paying too much attention to it and shaping our ICT for D research priorities. We don't know how important it's going to be fairly clearly, because it hasn't come out yet. We won't know until at least 2020 how important it's going to be in shaping the agenda. So our best guide to understanding how important the post-2015 agenda is going to be how important were the MDGs, have the MDGs been in shaping the international development agenda. And if we do that, there's various bits of considered analysis. And basically what they would argue is the MDGs have been absolutely central to shaping discourse and debate around international development. They've been pretty important in ensuring large amounts of aid funding have been maintained and actually increased. They've made some difference to policy, and they've probably only made a relatively limited impact on development outcomes and development practice. So that's a mixed picture overall, but if we kind of average all of that out, we would say that there's sufficient evidence there to say that the post-2015 agenda is going to be worth taking notice of. That's the relationship between post-2015 and the overall field of international development. Obviously, what we would like to know more precisely is what is going to be the impact of post-2015 on research priorities, and perhaps even more importantly, research funding. And we can get some sense of that from a couple of areas. First of all, we can get a sense of that by analysing what has been the influence of the MDGs on research strategy and research priorities to date. And here we find a continuum. This end, for example, we've got IDRC. They really didn't particularly consider the MDGs. They were very peripheral to their setting of research priorities. CEDA lies somewhere in the middle. They've given some attention to the MDGs in setting research priorities. And over at the end, we've got my own UK, well, I say my own, my country, I never lived one. UK DFID. For them, MDGs were absolutely central to their research priorities ever since around 2003. We could also look at, if we wanted to get a guide, not just at the MDGs historically, what influence they have had on the research agenda. We can also look at to what extent are key development research institutions engaging with the post-2015 agenda right now. If we did a little straw poll, we find that institutions in the US have not particularly engaged with that agenda to date, and that echoes what happened with the MDGs to some extent. But if we look at the leading development think tanks outside the US, we find that all of them have got some kind of post-2015 research initiative, project going on. So I'm talking there of ODI and IDS in the UK, I'm talking about the North-South Institute in Canada, and the German Development Institute. Those are ranked in the think tank ranking as the top non-US development think tanks. So, in all, the evidence is not overwhelming, but it clearly suggests that the post-2015 agenda is going to be important in shaping development, and particularly it may be important in shaping research priorities and research strategies. And probably, although we may not be clear about the absolute strength of it, in relative terms, it is going to be the single most important factor shaping the future of international development and development research. So, if our research is in sync with the post-2015 agenda, it's going to add to its credibility at the very least, and perhaps at most it's going to increase the audience we get for our research, and it's going to increase the opportunities for funding. Okay, so we've asked some of the background questions. At the moment, the answer seems to be, yeah, it's worth kind of taking note of, and it's probably going to have some influence on the research agenda. So, what is the agenda, the post-2015 agenda, going to consist of? As I noted, it is already being formed, but what we can do is we can analyse those 4 documents I identified which were critical to setting the post-2015 agenda. And we can then compare them to core documents that set the Millennium Development Goals agenda. And if we do that, we can identify two aspects. Firstly, things that are already there in the MDGs that are going to carry on within the post-2015 agenda. And then secondly, new things that were not there in the MDGs and are going to be part of the post-2015 agenda. All right, start with the continuation similarities. Fairly obviously, a core similarity is going to be poverty, and there's going to be continuing themes around social development, so health and education and women's empowerment, and environment as well. And within the social development goals, they often relate most clearly to the poorest in societies, and so an ongoing ICT for D research priority is going to be ICTs and the poor. How can ICTs deliver income and health and education and female empowerment to those at the base of the pyramid? Note that this is not ICTs in developing countries generally, but quite specifically ICTs looking at the relation with those on lowest incomes. One implication of that now and in the future is going to be fairly obviously that mobile is going to be a high priority. Yeah, fine, we already knew that. It's not news. And if you look at the ICTD conference papers, mobile has pretty good coverage. There are rather fewer papers relating to health and to education and to women's empowerment, though there are some. I think I'm right in saying that there is not a single paper that directly connects ICTs to poverty. There are papers that link to some of the issues around poverty, but I think there is far too little work that has made the direct connection between ICTs and poverty. And I actually think that's one of the reasons why ICTs have somewhat slipped off the development agenda in the last few years, because we have not been able to provide a convincing narrative about the way in which ICTs link to poverty, and as a result ICTs have been relatively marginalised in the development agenda as compared to where they were, say, for example, 10 years ago. Okay, so those are the things that are going to remain the same. What about the differences? First of all, I'll deal with that at an overall level, and I'm illustrating that using tag clouds for, first of all here, the MDGs, and then secondly here, the PTDA, the post-2015 development agenda. I'm using tag clouds just as the illustration, but underlying that is some word count textual analysis. So, what do we see? First of all, I hope you can all see that fairly clearly, a much greater emphasis on sustainability. That's going to mean sustainability in an environmental sense, but I actually also think it's going to mean sustainability in a general development sense. Whereas in the year 2000 there was a sense of development meaning we're going forwards, I think from now on there's also going to be a sense of development meaning we're not falling backwards and we're sustaining what we actually need to work to sustain what we've already achieved and not move backwards. There is going to be, you'll see there, greater emphasis on environmental issues, particularly a greater emphasis on climate change. Climate change gets mentioned about 5 times more in the post-2015 agenda than it did within the MDGs document. There is going to be less relative emphasis on aid, ODA, official development assistance. There's going to be less relative emphasis on that in the post-2015 agenda, and relatively a greater emphasis on other forms of financing, tax and remittances and private investment. And related to that, much greater recognised role for business in development and a greater role for cooperation and also for partnerships. So this isn't, as the MDGs largely were, about aid agencies and government. This is truly recognising development as a multi-stakeholder activity. Growth appears where it was not particularly there before. So despite the limited appeal of trickle-down economics, it's a recognition growth is still going to be central to development, and there is a greater recognition of that. And lastly, and represented by the appearance of the word implementation, the delivery agenda starts to appear, a greater concern not just with setting targets, but also with how to deliver those targets via implementation. So each of those has got implications that we could discuss for the ICT for the research agenda, because many of these are knowledge gaps. Where, for example, is the work on ICTs and sustainability? Where is the work, for example, on ICTs and climate change? I just find it mind-blowing. It's been the same at the last few ICTD conferences. Climate change is fairly obviously the major threat to development and to the planet over the next few years. Climate change is also going to be the major, by far the biggest source of transfers of technology and finance from the global north to the global south. But if you come to an ICTD conference, you would not know that. I don't see anybody mentioning climate change at all. I don't think there were any papers about ICTs and financing, nothing about ICTs and aid and remittances and tax and investment. There's a little bit of work linking ICT applications to growth, but that seems to be a kind of incidental link. There isn't a strong, explicit link to growth, and specifically linking to growth for those on lowest incomes. And there's some research that's recognising that ICTs are part of implementation of development projects, but there's nothing linking to the World Bank's new delivery science agenda, which we don't know whether that's going to catch fire or not, but certainly at the moment that seems like an important agenda. And lastly, I want to hone in on some more specific issues. First, by thinking really about what's the difference in the context within which the MDGs were written versus the context now. And you, I'm sure, can think about the differences between the year 2000 and now and think what some of the differences are. But one of the big differences for us, of course, is the year 2000 was the time of internet, dot-com hope and hype. Now it's very, very different. We hear daily news stories about the dark side of ICTs. ICTs have a much greater role in economic and social and political life than they did in 2000, but because they've become mainstreamed, they've actually disappeared to some extent from the development agenda. You can see that very clearly looking at the comparison of the two documents and therefore hence the comparison of differences between the two agendas. You can see that blue is MDGs, red is the post-2015. There's been an absolute collapse of focus on ICTs and all things digital. So they are very unlikely to command the same role in the development agenda that they did in the early 2000s up until the maximum watershed of the WSIS Tunis meeting in 2005. So that's the bad news for those of us in ICT. But I'll end up looking at three areas where there might be more opportunities to link ICTs into the forthcoming agenda. The first one is the open agenda. I don't know if is it the open science thing next door that we can hear? They had open data before and open source as well. So open development, open data, open source. I think to some extent we're already engaging with that agenda to some extent in ICT4D, but clearly there's quite a lot more work to be done. The second area links to, I don't have time to go into it, but a largely unseen agenda that is underlying, I think, a lot of the documentation, and that is the incursion of complexity science into development and the recognition, the increasing recognition that development problems and development initiatives are increasingly should be seen as complex adaptive systems. We could take that off in a number of directions. For example, we could take it off in the direction of agile, looking at agile methodologies in ICT4D. We could take it off directly into the direction of complexity. But I think a far stronger current is the one that's represented here, going from absolute zero to a large number of mentions. And this arises from the fact that we know in the 21st century there are going to be increasing numbers of environmental, economic, political, social shocks to developing countries, communities. And we know what we need in order to deal with this. We need resilience. So resilience is really coming onto the development agenda. And our ICT4D priorities could be twofold. One is understanding the relationship, the role that ICTs play in building or weakening resilience of individuals, of communities, supply systems and so on. And the second could be understanding how do we make our ICT systems more resilient. And finally, inequality. Inequality was mentioned relatively little within the MDGs. It's increased by 4 or 5 times in the post-2015 agenda because of the recognition that development is, by and large, traditional development, has not really delivered for everybody. It is overextending and it is polarizing societies. The response to inequality is inclusive agendas, inclusive growth, inclusive development. We'll see a massive increase there in the recognition of the importance of inclusive approaches, inclusive strategies. And one obvious route that applies to us very much is innovation. Innovation separately has risen very much up the development agenda recently and looks like it's going to carry on for the next 5 to 10 years, if we could guess. And the way ICT4D can be linking to these is in the connection between those two, which is the research agenda on inclusive innovation. If you'd like to know more about that, I've just published a paper on our development informatics working group series about conceptualizing inclusive innovation and research priorities for inclusive innovation. There are many ways that connects to ICTs, but one obvious way would be to study the processes by which new ICT-based goods and services are innovated for low-income consumers. So, I've only had a very short time to cover a huge area. The actual path ahead remains somewhat uncertain until the post-2015 agenda actually is concretised in the next year or so. But I hope I've helped you to understand more of what the future development context will hold, that context being the one in which you're going to be doing your doctoral and also later research. Thank you.